thought that because it's graveyard time, we'll make sure that you are engaged and that you get to know the panels and their expertise that they're having. So in a nutshell, do you guys mind introducing yourselves? I mean, when I can't introduce you as perfect as you guys. So maybe who you are, what you do, and then we'll take it from there.
Fabulous. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Phumzile Mthethwa. I was born in Kwatema on the east end of the Gauteng province. I am of the generation of 1986, having started organizing in anti-apartheid struggles then. You know, it was the 76 and 86 generation. I have a long history of organizing and working around various struggles, LGBTIQ liberation being one of them. And I'm sure as Masibu as well, we are very excited to have been invited to come and share some of our thoughts about, history, perspectives, challenges, and going forward. And a part of that emanates from quite a deep commitment we had as the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality that campaigned from 1994 when we set it up to guarantee the constitutional clause and basically the Bill of Rights, but also to engage in a reformist agenda to win rights for LGBTI people, poor people, and the working class. And of course, as a continuation of the Lesbian and Gay Equality Project, as the continuation of the coalition was the establishment of the Lesbian and Gay Equality Project, which continued that work, but more locating itself in relation to the post-apartheid agenda of South Africa. And more than that, I am employed by a feminist movement building organization called Just Associates. I work in Southern Africa. I'm an internationalist, very committed to the liberation of all of us who are oppressed, and.
That's a list. Mr. Jaha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Mazibuko. That's my first name. The surname is Jaha. I am a straight boy using new language, a cishet man who beat Pumi to a post we had both applied for in the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality. I'm a full 18 days older than Pumi.
17.
My primary identity is that of being an internationalist African revolutionary who's concerned with how do we organize the mass of ordinary people to overcome oppression, alienation, and exploitation in all aspects of our lives. So even my approach to LGBTQI oppression and how we mobilize and build forces to achieve our full emancipation is primarily informed by going deep to the root, to the structural and systemic roots of oppression, of exploitation. For short, you can therefore regard me as a socialist who's concerned with complete emancipation of society, particularly all marginalized and oppressed strata. I'm based in the Eastern Cape province. I'm generally working on rural struggles, whether it's rural democracy, whether it's land reform, whether it's women's rights in the rural context. That's who I am. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming out to us about you being cisgender. We acknowledge and welcome you in this space. other than that, you guys have quite a vast journey of struggles and, I mean, politically coming. But in this regard, we're talking about the liberation struggle and politics within our movement. Let's go to basics to try and understand what this theme is telling us, working with each other. What does that mean in terms of the liberation struggle of the LGBT movement in your context of understanding? Either or, Kenneth.
I think one of the first thing is locating the reason why we need to work with each other. What are we working with each other for? And then we will get to how we work with each other. In this context, when we read particularly Southern Africa and the liberation struggles around that, there's a particular similarity in which liberation was won, right? We can speak about Ghana, but there's particular things around our region where one can say the enemy seemed to be identifiable. The enemy is being colonized. The enemy is apartheid that was oppressing black people, right? And in that sense, it was easier to forge a unifying agenda to defeat the enemy. Post-liberation, and in South Africa being the last one, right, in 94, post-liberation, the working with each other has been diluted because whilst there is a freedom, there are so many, our context tells us that it's not COVID that brought inequality, right? We knew that. So the enemies become unclear in relation to how is a rebuilding of a nation, a rebuilding of a region, a rebuilding of, a continent for that matter, is so much distorted when you have a black government that is our people in power, but you have these vast exclusions. And so what that brings for us in relation to thinking about framing what it means to fight some of these things sometimes we don't understand. We speak neoliberalism, capitalism, structural adjustments, all these words in the language that we've been talking about that sometimes we don't even understand what that means. But by and large, to sum it up, is what are the things that keep reinforcing inequality, exclusion, oppression, and discrimination. And so as LGBTI people, who very much our identities, we enter the movement, the organizations and so on, fighting from a place of being discriminated because of our sexual orientation or gender identity. But what we have come to understand is that, and being from this country, is that my right to get married does not guarantee me a house, a bed, running water, and so forth. And so the working with each other, for me, has meant inside the LGBTI movement, understanding the importance of strengthening our political agenda and the ways in which we do things internally. But it has also meant the importance of being active outside of the movement by locating the agenda of the LGBTI people within other progressive agendas. The other day, I think, Comrade Wenjinji was saying, do we show up for other struggles? When we say no one gives us solidarity. And I think from a place of working with each other, locating why. is a fundamental question of why do we need to work with each other? And therein lies what are the shared commonalities, struggles that are so important to build a unifying platform for which we have to organize.
Mazi, what's your take on working together?
I don't think we can imagine any thoroughgoing emancipation being achieved by a group that works on its own. This is a global lesson, but even more so for us in Southern Africa. So if you look at the range of forces that defeated colonialism, that defeated apartheid, it was not workers on their own, it was not youth on their own, it was not women on their own, but it was a broad alliance of forces, call them a historic bloc, a big historic bloc. Comrades in America say, how do we build a bigger we? I think that's the question. How do we build a bigger we to achieve liberation? This is the question today. In my view, if we understand the roots of our oppression, the roots of our alienation and marginalization and exploitation, then we will see why we have to work together. So let's think about, for example, the fact that the public health service in all our countries in Southern Africa is far from meeting the health needs of LGBTI people. Can we then think about addressing and winning queer health needs, queer health rights outside of a bigger set of forces that change the public health system? So, for example, many of these governments are not able to provide sufficient budgets because of policies that say keep the public sector small, austerity policies. Can queer people fight austerity policies on their own without linking up with HIV positive people, without linking up with rural people who do not have access to clinics and so on? So building a bigger we in that sense, in the case of the public health crisis I'm talking about, makes sense. But you can extend that across the board. Zimbabwe is not far from having elections. Will those elections really take Zimbabwe forward to a stable, rights-guaranteeing, rights-affirming democracy? Can the struggle for queer liberation be located outside of the real democratization of Zimbabwe? Trade unions were fighting in Zimbabwe for workers' rights. Small farmers were fighting in Zimbabwe against elite capture of land reform by Mugabe's cronies. All of those forces are fighting in their silos, but are their issues not common? Does it not make sense to build this bigger platform? That's one approach to it. But I think there are a number of questions we have to think about in working with each other. What was the vision of liberation when there was the struggle for liberation? How far did that vision of liberation really go to think about LGBTQIA issues? In my view, not very far. How do we ensure that a renewed liberation agenda can ensure that we think of liberation in the fullest meaning of that word? But then, what will it take to move from where we are to that bigger, deeper realization of what liberation means? What is the role of LGBTQI activists to achieve that broader vision, to ensure that society as a whole actually takes a progressive perspective? Can we fight still in our little corners as the different oppressed segments of society without realizing actually that whilst the enemy may be hidden for me, but actually the enemy is still very common, because we're all still marginalized in various ways, exploited and oppressed, but we're not finding each other. You know, I was a rugby player being from the Eastern Cape. In rugby, when you go to the scrum, it's 8 people out of the team of 15 who go to the scrum. If you go to the scrum and just 3 of you are not fully engaged, the scrum will collapse and you'll even injure yourselves. Can we scrum going forward if not all of us are not holding each other sufficiently in solidarity and in a shared political commitment for emancipation? That's my approach.
quite interesting, the historical strength of where we're coming from at a national level, regional and international. And that's obviously the bigger liberation struggle politically. I want to pull it back into the queer movement. Do we have a political struggle, liberation? My country, R&L is a problem, so bear with me. The liberation struggle, because I'm trying to look at, yes, apartheid, apartheid, racial, all of that took place. In our movement, what's the ideological theory that we are working from, and what is our political position as a movement? Do we have one? Do we? Anybody that wants to take a microphone, do we have a political position? And what is the ideology that, that we are working towards getting liberation in our movement? You guys can take it, and if anybody wants to take the microphone, please take the corners there. This is an interactive conversation. We always know that these spaces are always very political, but at the same time as a movement, I believe that we have not come to a common agreement about the ideological framework that we are working from. Are you standing at the, oh, Sammy, are you going to the microphone? Lovely. I also have another one here, and then you two can always help us to also affirm our speakers that are going to contribute. Please.
Anzio, we do?
Unfortunately, we do have an ideology. It seems like our ideology is inherently classist. Our ideology is an ideology of a middle class. Our ideology is an ideology of the rights of some over others. Our ideology is anti-working class. Our ideology is anti-poor. And if we can call that out here in this room and begin to have an honest conversation about that, maybe we can get to an ideology that is for all and not just for some.
Thank you very much. Sam?
Yeah, it's good to see my comrades in the front that I have not seen for long. For someone who has been in the movement for a long time, we have got to a space where we have multiple ideologies and we don't have a collective ideology. And I think that's why you find with our struggle, we've actually lost what that vision is about. And I think in the last couple of days, we've all been talking about how we've actually negated some of the different facets of our communities that we have not focused on. And even if you look at the current discourse around decriminalization, not all of us are up for it. So I think it's something that is worth reflecting given some of the conversations that are happening now. What is it that we need to do as a collective? And I think that's something we have lost, because even when you look at some of the younger or middle activists that we see today, people also don't have that queer politics that we started with. Perhaps it's also to do with us, the leadership, who have not been able to extend that to them to be able to understand what that politics of the day is about.
Before you go, what went wrong? Why is it that we are not able, and for so long as the movement, how long has the movement been up? In the 80s?
Yes.
From the 80s?
Yeah.
Why is it that we still don't have an ideology today?
Yeah. I think a lot of us have been swayed by the dollar sign, because HIV became very topical, and yes, it did affect a lot of us who came out in the 80s and living with HIV to date. But I'm more than my HIV status. And I want the whole package about who I am as an African and as a person. And I'm not getting that. And a lot of people that are coming out today are very comfortable with where we have landed, which is just looking at one part of our lives and not the holistic picture. And I think that's where we lost it.
I want to start off by saying that we come to the movement, which I use very advisedly, the movement, from a place of being, discriminated, excluded, and oppressed based on our sexual orientation and identity. And that in and of itself, by coming in like that, leaves very little room for an ideological development that is able to put a politically shared agenda. So I think we need to recognize that and for what it is, And so our histories of organizing, and there's been attempts in many ways to forge unifying agendas from in South Africa, from, before even apartheid was defeated, putting LGBTI issues within the liberation movement, and then of course the national coalition in this country. I don't know how many convenings we were part of in Africa. Yesterday was Africa Day. We issued a Maibuye pledge in 2018 as LGBTIQ people from the continent. We convened in Nairobi. We've had many, many convenings that in a way reflect a vision of the Africa we would like to live in as LGBTIQ people, right? And that vision for winning full liberation, unfortunately, we haven't been able to organize at the most local place about what it means to achieve it. Because we work in crisis, we have to have organizations that are able to carry, health programs, advocacy, and so on. But I think also absent to that, in the important work that all of us do in this room, is a critical reflection on the work that we are doing, whether it enables emancipation from exactly what we are doing. And those that are like here will be tired of hearing me say we do the same thing but expect different results.
I think NGO has opened up a very interesting field. So is critical of what he calls a middle-class, classist perspective. I share that critique, but I want to say something else. In our spaces, there is talk of feminism, there is talk of decoloniality, there is talk of being progressive, there is talk of challenging white supremacy. I think that's present. And of course, full LGBTQI liberation. And so I think those are what we can call the building blocks towards an ideology. I don't think we're there yet fully. So I just want to pick up 2 points in that regard. So if you look at the dominant discourse, dominant ideas on feminism, my own dissatisfaction is that actually this is liberal, mainstream feminism that doesn't go to the heart of the oppression of people on a gender basis. How far as Africans can we go to really develop an endogenous radical feminism that understands oppression, exploitation in their full complexity, and have a radical feminist politics for real? I think that's where then the issues need to be taken further, taken deeper. The other issue that's absent, I didn't mention it deliberately, but it's quite absent. It's what Enzio was pointing to. This question of class. It's not narrow working class politics in that sense, but for me, it's about understanding the economic system that is at the root of much of the injustices we see. The elite in Zimbabwe, that is ruling Zimbabwe, is extracting minerals in Hwange, in Marange, even in the Congo, and is now expanding to Mozambique, similar to the elite in South Africa. We can mention all other elites. That's about a backward capitalism in Southern Africa. That's not about redistributing resources of society to everyone, which just captures these for a few. But then, before this black elite, there's even a more established economic elite. That's white, that's global. Julius Malema would call them white monopoly capital. I'm being crude when I put it in those terms. But there's a system of taking profits, denying the large majority of people from the economic benefits from the resources of our country, ensuring that the majority of the people live in the townships that are underserviced, without work, without services, and so on. So that's the question. When I talk about class, I'm talking about the economic system. How far do people as LGBTI activists think about the economic system and what it means for the reproduction of oppression, and then what it therefore should mean for building a transformative perspective, a transformative politics? I think that's very absent in our thinking. I've picked up outside this booklet, Reading Together, a Bible study method from IM. So in the spirit of working with each other, I think there's a very important lesson that can be very useful from the methodology of this booklet. If we're talking about feminism, despite my critique, if we're talking about decoloniality, if we're talking about challenging white supremacy, if we're talking about challenging heteropatriarchy, if we're talking about understanding the economic system, developing a view on the economic system, should we not go back to this basic of just studying what these operations are about? I think for me, that would be a real foundational, long-lasting basis for building sustainable forms of working with each other into the long term in ways then that go beyond limited forms of our liberation politics.
Can I
Sorry
just
to be
add
so
one
long.
thing? Just one thing on that second last thing. The thing is, we will never be able to shape the working together if we are unable to analyze the context in which we live and work in. I can program and reprogram and adapt according to COVID, but if I don't understand why aid is suffocating Malawi the way that aid is suffocating Malawi, and only read it in relation to, will I get money from Oxfam, I will never be able to inform the strategy that is necessary for that. And I think oftentimes we find ourselves that we keep developing the activities that we are going to do from January to December, because we're going to win most like in the 12 months, right? We keep developing the January to December log frame outside of what is happening in the province, the country, the region, and globally. We do not engage in a way in which one can think and read about what are the trends that are influencing why my mother is living this way, why there is no water in this thing, and why cyclone response is going to happen in the way in which cyclone responses happen, why the disappearance of frontline defenders happen. And if we are unable to do that, I think because all of that, to a large extent, it is located in the socio-political and economic ways that actually are shaped to continue to exclude and oppress us.
The microphones are open, so feel free to just walk towards the microphone to speak to us, because we're going to have an interactive. It's not going to be the panel speaking and then we go back. So feel free, if you have an urge to get to a microphone, please do that. Virginia, please bless us with your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you to my fellow old crocs.
Speak for yourself,
Yes,
please.
please.
I think taking from what Pumi was saying, I think just also understanding why petrol is so expensive is important for us, right? Because that will allow us to move away from thinking that our identity struggles of whether we are lesbians or we are gay are more important than the price of bread. Will allow us to understand who or what the enemy is. But my question then is, how do we begin, Pumi and Mazibuko, to develop that foundation of the understanding of the political context, the economic context, and even the social context, that will enable us to understand why it is important for us to be part of the struggle for climate justice, to be part of the struggle against privatization of water or privatization.
We have succeeded to, not that legislations have changed, but in terms of civil and political rights, we've achieved that. And that the interest right now, the issue of classism is very important, and because it's economical conversations that are taking place. Does that mean that we are now shifting to the second generation of rights only now, realizing that all throughout the basic civil and political rights that we've been working for, we've achieved them by default of being able to live in our towns, countries? What does that mean now? Because I completely understand to say that there's a need for intersectional sectoral work, but why are we not part of being in that bigger sector? I'm sure there are other organizations that are doing it in individual countries, but I'm talking about holistically in terms of moving beyond the liberation politics that we're having. Either or. I know it's heavy, but...
Our societies in Southern Africa and the political elites that lead them cannot give us more than what we have unless we build new historic forces. We need to think of ourselves as the constituting elements of a new, bigger we, a new, bigger historic bloc. That's going to be so crucial. The liberation politics of the past are exhausted, finished, and are actually turning in a very negative direction. So this thing I was talking about of study is important. And I think it's an important first step. But a bigger teacher than just reading or discussing or analysis is the struggle. So with every round of hate attacks, with every round of discrimination, do we take the political moment to draw new programmatic conclusions, new political conclusions? For me, I think that's the missing dynamic. How do we use the defeats, at times victories, rollbacks, pushbacks, at times advances? How do we use those key moments to draw new political conclusions, and then use those conclusions to think about how do we build a bigger we? So for example, today, the oppressor is not a racist government of the minority. We've said enough of who the oppressor is now today. But as Wenjinji is saying, queer liberation cannot be separated from bigger gender, social, ecological, economic, and political justice. How do we then think about the struggle of the rural woman for access to land, for her to have land in her own name and right, and then take up that struggle as queer activists, and ensure two things. A queer perspective informs that struggle, but also queer activists themselves also embrace a wider liberation agenda that undoes oppression. I think that's the challenge that needs to be addressed to take us to where Virginia is thinking.
But we
But
also
are we
make
welcome
the
in those
assumptions.
spaces? I mean, many of us have gone into the women's sectors and spaces as queer women, but we're always seen as a special child in the corner that doesn't really fit with all the other cisgender vaginas that are around.
But you
become
see,
Fumi,
I have,
Fumi, can
no,
I come in?
but
Oh.
hang on.
Okay.
You see what Anzio was saying and what you are saying. There is a problematic assumption that the woman in the rural area is not a lesbian. You see, in what you are saying, there is a thing, and some of us who crisscross the continent and are able to be in rural places and find like trans folks and lesbians, we know that the framing around why can't I join the woman in the rural area as a solidarity, as opposed to, do I know the women or the people in the rural areas, what their struggles are, and how can I link with them if I am committed to strengthen? And some of these reflections we had, Mas, when we were saying at some point, the reading was around the LGBTI movement in South Africa is weakening because many organizations were closing, you remember? And then one of the things we realized, what was also humbling and beautiful, was that so many openly LGBTI people are organizing in different movements in this country, you know? So they are not organizing in the LGBTI movement, but you will find them in the anti-privatization movement, you will find them in the struggles that refugees and migrants are waging, you will find them in the land rights, etc., etc. And I think there, the question is, I think it's our challenge, all of us, to what extent are we able, across progressive movements, to advance even the issues and the realities of those that continue to be on the margins, even within those movements?
No, thanks for that correction. I take it. The point I was making is, so think about feminist politics. Majority of organizations and people who are organizing on the ground do not have a conscious feminist perspective. So at times it even gets even more silence because it's assumed, because it's unsaid. So what I was saying was, let's surface it, let's visibilize it.
Yeah.
Let's visibilize the queer issue consciously so that it becomes part of rural women's struggles. People may be involved as queer activists in a range of struggles, but is there a conscious strategy to surface queer issues, queer demands, so that actually the rural movement takes up queer issues as they are integrated issues? For me, that was the issue that I was trying to raise. And I don't think we have a clear strategy in that regard. So then, Linda, you were saying, but the spaces are closed. You were giving the example.
No, I'm not saying the spaces are closed. They allow us to sit in the space.
Okay, yeah.
But the last document does not speak about us, but we've sat with them for 5 months, working through the document. What does that mean? If we're trying to intersect intergeneral movements that are...
Look, I understand that kind of debilitating, tiring, emotionally taxing exclusion. But look, my fault in life is to believe that ultimately humanity can free itself. So if I believe that, as Bishop Tutu once said, one then becomes like a Christian, hopelessly hopeful, that with constant pushing, with never tiring up, you have to break the closed doors. You have to keep pushing even against those kind of exclusion. I don't think it's going to end, but that's why then strategy is important. So for example, in trade unions in Southern Africa, finally they talk about gender equality. But you know, it took a rape at the COSATU Congress for COSATU to eventually talk about gender. Then they got to talk about gender, and then what they did was to appropriate the gender language to perpetuate patriarchy. So how does the strategy then shift of feminist activists in COSATU to change that? I think it's going to be a constant struggle. Yeah. I don't think a struggle is ever won and resolved. I think there's always going to be constant struggles all throughout. Again, it goes back to that question. In every moment, how do we build the forces for liberation? How do we expand those forces? How do we build a bigger we, even in what are supposed to be progressive organizations, which are going to go back? Let me not go, I talk a lot, sorry, I'll stop there.
The microphones are open. I see someone at the other corner. And maybe an additional question that I can put out, maybe somebody will take this microphone at this end. As the queer movement, have we been working together? And with what sectors have we been intersecting in order to advance that collective agenda? Maybe you can also pick that question up with your other contributions that you would be doing. Please go ahead.
So I think in response to what Vijay was saying earlier on, is that I think even here in this room there's a crisis, right? We need to move beyond liberation politics. But if we do not understand liberation politics, we cannot move beyond them. We have a unique opportunity as leaders sitting here in this room every 2 years to have some political education in our space. And my very harsh critique, I was also there at some point, we've been discussing this in and amongst ourselves. If we are drinking from Monday to Friday, when are we able to come to the table and actually engage on issues that are important? But that's not to say we don't need space to debrief, to decompress, to enjoy one another's company, etc. But can you imagine our strength here if we understood what was happening in the environment? if we understood what was happening in landless movements, if we understood why the GBB movement is moving slowly, when we start to understand those politics holistically, then we stop seeing our struggle as exceptional.
Yeah.
Yes, we are oppressed. Yes, we have our own politics that we need to address. Yes, we have issues that we want to bring to the table. But here at this convening, we have the unique opportunity to align our politics to one another, to hear where there are contentions in our space, and to move from there.
Do we have a collective agenda at an African level, at a national level? Because a large number of countries have got more than one organization. Do we work together at country level? Is there a manifesto that we can sell to our governments and say, these 3 human rights issues are of great concern to us? Do we have any of that as a movement? Anybody? There's more than 50 people in this room with 2 beautiful microphones that are just waiting for you to move closer.
Hi, Linda. I'm not answering your question. I'm just thinking out loud.
All right.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your offerings. I mean, a lot has come up. But I just want to say, also language matters. I don't prefer the language of liberation. I prefer the language of freedom. Because for me, liberation limits us to the discourse of democracy and constitutionalism, where we're talking legal reforms, and we know the contradictions and limitations of that. Whereas freedom, for me, opens up possibilities, whether you're talking about economic justice, or whether you're talking about orgasms, as someone said earlier on today. But I like the idea of freedom, so just to start there. But I also think one of the things we need to appreciate is that it's okay to not have a center that holds us. It's okay for us to battle with our consciousness and its own contradiction. I refuse to be burdened by the model of trade unions with membership and reading groups and those structures. But there are lessons that we can get, or rather we can draw from the trade union movement. We just celebrated May Day in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and the stats are saying only 30% are actually members of unions. There's a challenge with younger people who are not taking it up. But regardless of where unions are and what the model they're using is, at the core of it, it's still the idea of consciousness and practicing the work and being visible in many of these spaces. But let's also take some stock. My leaders, in your time during the NCGLE, history reminds us that we can categorize you as Chatterist as a compliment, because you come from a generation that said, what is our program? Whether we're talking about UDF or whether we're talking about the submission made in CODESA on LGBTI rights in South Africa between 1992 and 94. And I think we are led by you in that history in terms of how we organized the inclusiveness of different voices, being mindful of class and different genders. But we're also in a different context. As you said, capitalism and inequalities, they mutate. And so I can't imagine us being that movement of the Chatterist movement at this point in time. And yes, Mazibuko, we can talk about feminism, but there are many strands. The catalog has widened. Other people are talking about practices of resistance, practices of freedom. Other people are talking about community practices. Other people are talking about black vernaculars. All of these things to signpost the visibility over the years in terms of how people have claimed spaces. But I do think
To learning, to engage in political education so that
What
we
does
can...
this mean for the different regional
And here is the thing
networks?
for me. One of the things I wanted to say is that maybe not liberation or freedom, is that we have not unpacked to a full extent what the democracy winnings have meant for our struggle, that in turn we continue to legitimize them, knowing that they will never deliver for us. You know? So there's a democracy in Zimbabwe, right? It's almost impossible to advance any program for on health, on like law reform, on anything, it's impossible because the context is such that there's a democracy, but it's not going to do anything. In the same way, I'll speak more about at least where I work deeply in, just like in Malawi, where aid is the democracy. It runs, it informs what the ministry is going to do. It's the INGOs that inform what the ministry should do. And so if first we do not do that reading of the moment, there is no way we can cut and paste the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, Norma, and think that they will work today. And nor are we saying that that is what we should do. There's a part about lessons, but there's a part based on also what I was saying earlier on. What is the current moment telling us that is so important to shape what we need to do, that manifest, And part of it is we will go to lobby the UN, we will go to lobby the African Commission for People's Rights, People and Human Rights. We will go to the AU, we will go to all the UN agencies, and it's so important that we go. But I am not sure if that freedom is going to come from that.
I agree with both Norma and Pumi. So Norma, for me, the issue today to reinvent, to re-envision a new politics is the slogan that's about Sifuna Zonke, because actually our liberation is not possible without us claiming all that belongs to us. For me, that's where the issue should be. COVID-19, the long-term economic crisis means the lives of the majority are lives of rot, are lives of decay. And these are going to deepen. And if those deepen, violence against women, violence against queer people, criminality, all of those horrible things are going to be on the rise throughout our societies. How do we rebuild an agenda and a set of forces that can reclaim all that belongs to us? For me, that's where the issue is. And I think it's a question of how we use this Kopano space on a biannual basis, but also rejigging our organizing strategy in ways that go beyond the limits of the UN platforms, the AU platforms, the SADC platforms, but really building a critical mass. We don't have a critical mass where we know that across societies, there's enough people who are got a common grammar, who've got a common vision about the future and ways of finding each other as we go along. We're not going to get it all if we don't have that.
We are running in our last 15 minutes of our conversation.
You don't say.
Yes, you guys talk too much, but it's a good thing. Comrades, the microphones are waiting for you. Please say something on those microphones. We cannot have 3 or 4 people speaking in the room, which is a very crucial conversation about working together and the politics that are happening in here and thereof. And I think most importantly also reflecting on what the next steps of advancing good strategies of getting us to work together beyond the struggles that we are experiencing. My sister, please.
Thanks so much. I hope I can call Comrade Pumi and Comrade Mazibuko comrades.
It depends.
Earlier comrades say there's a history of, we have to have come a long way with each other. But I mean, Comrade Mazibuko and Comrade Pumi, I think you've both said something multiple very important contributions. But I've got a very key question around this idea of building critical mass when we can't even find our own center. And I want to take us back a little bit in your input about, and your reflection on Zimbabwe in particular, where part of the difficulty is an inability to mobilize what feels like separated groups who mobilize around particular ideas. But of course, those ideas are cross-cutting. And part of the issue is that a lack of common base. 2 weeks ago, there were comrades who convened around the idea of discussing populism and what it looks like in the region. And one of the key issues, and your intervention was, why do we not bring everybody together to work around a common goal, right? Some of the folks in that room were saying, we want to organize this LGBTI sector, this sector, this sector, this sector to come and create a base and to push out this government. I'm not going to particularly speak about one particular one. I don't want to get in trouble with anybody. And then other comments were saying, we've tried to do that. We've done that before. There were years ago when this structure that we're proposing, we've brought it forward, right? And so this idea of reinventing and creating, understanding and reflecting on our differences, but also trying to create a critical base. What is the point of us creating that critical base when we all feel like we can achieve what we want to achieve through different things? And Comrade Mazibuko, I'm kind of a little bit disappointed of your views on feminism. I feel like they should have shifted a little bit throughout the years, because I think actively there have been various people who've made local interventions on what a local African feminist politic looks like. And that has informed the way that we organize. So even using this as a starting base, how do we create this base when we can't even agree, on the kind of politic that leads us, or the vision that we want to kind of achieve in the long run?
Sorry,
Thank you
Chair.
very much.
I didn't get the critique that Marseille is making on feminism. Maybe if you can restate the point that the critique she's making of what I said, I didn't get the full critique.
Or you want to feel
Yeah.
the critic?
Yeah.
Can you please have him feel the critic, please, so that you can understand? He
It's
just wants to
disappoint-
understand the context.
No. The critique that I was challenging is this idea that feminism, of course, historically, I think a lot of us have had very Western references. But I think to completely say that that's where it's rooted is erasing all of the local work that people have been doing, who've reflected on their own context and built knowledge and tools from there.
So the importance of really affirming African narratives within the context of feminism.
Black African feminists.
Black feminists.
Black African
So
feminists.
we'd like to have your take on it
No,
before
no,
we...
no.
Hold on, I have
Okay.
someone there that wants to speak.
Oh.
Yes, my brother, I'm not sure whether my pronoun is right for you, but comrade, please speak with us.
Hello,
The microphone is still waiting for someone there, ne? At the other corner.
I'm Eddie. I work for an NGO called Freedom House, and we have a program that provides financial support to activists at risk, including LGBTQI activists. I have a question that might seem critical or critic, but it's a question. I try to avoid asking it. But to which extent money or external funding was critical in the struggle or the fight for political liberation on your time, during your time? Well, I mean, the struggle is still ongoing. But to which extent money, or if you wish, external funding, proposal writing, were critical to the fight? I heard, since we start this gathering about decolonizing the politic, stop the dicta from funders. But we seem to forget that the movement across the world are deeply leaning on money and funding than the struggle. If you give me the little latitude to make a parallel with other contexts, like the Congo, this is another context, obviously, but the standard NGOs or local civil society organization fail where the social movement, or they call them citizen movement, succeeded. They didn't need any funding. They just needed to be out. And they ended up pushing the dictatorship out. So once again, to which extent were you leaning on external funding during your movement? Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys you want to first take up for you to just level the grounds about acknowledging the rich heritage of black feminism in our country and make
The rights of women in particular. And when we think about customary law, we think it's the chieftains, we think it's the men. But actually, there was a research we did of the first woman who got land in her own name and right. And what was very interesting there is exactly what you're pointing to: endogenous and indigenous African feminism. We like the sons of this village, must have a right to land. And in that sentence, that first woman was both borrowing from the customary idiom, but also combining it with the discourse of rights. So I recognize that in my daily research, in my daily activist work. I was just making a critique of mainstream feminism. There are many other examples which we can point to. When we were working out our strategy on the question of same-sex marriage, one of the things which we sought to do was to understand histories in the African context of same-sex relations, which also speak to ways of thinking, ways of doing that go beyond the binary. For me, so I've grappled with that. But then I want to put a caution to myself, not to you, Marcy. So even though I'm saying I've got this particular understanding and this particular experience and perspective of appreciating endogenous African feminist practices, I myself as a man, particularly a cishet man, I realize that I'm a product of an oppressive society. As an aspirant feminist, I realize my political formation process is going to be a lifelong process. I cannot ever think that I cannot then get things wrong and so on. So I don't have a problem at all with that critique. But what I'm appreciating is my exposure and my critical thinking about these things. And my apology when I was critiquing mainstream liberal feminism for then not actually acknowledging and recognizing what is a rich and diverse set of experiences which I've engaged with intellectually, politically, and so on. Then the last point is about this question of resources. I think this question of resources is very important because if our strategies, our programs are solely dependent on external funding, when that funding dries up, does that mean the struggle is over? That's why then I think we have to pay attention to self-financing. And self-financing, if you think about the church in Southern Africa, the millions of women who take out the last cent to pay every week is because they are convinced, it's because there's a spiritual connection. Can we in our work find a way in which we can build a spiritual connection to our vision of liberation?
But our local funders or businesses don't want to fund queer politics.
For me, those...
So how do we navigate the space if we have to keep running outside the countries?
No, I don't think we should depend on local businesses. I think we should depend on ourselves. I think we should self-finance. We can appeal to external donors, we can appeal to local businesses just as a stopgap measure.
Give us a few strategies of how do we fund ourselves, because it will be great to know.
We drink beer every weekend.
But background, backyard gardening, he says. We probably start
that's the example I was going to make. I was once in the branch of the Communist Party in Johannesburg. In that branch, we employed 2 people as full-time organizers. We organized a party every month end. All of us who were branch members donated food, donated meat, and the only thing we bought was alcohol. We sold the food, we sold the alcohol, we sold tickets. From that, we could finance the struggle through employing organizers. Backyard gardens could be another example. So we drink beer every weekend. But why do we take that beer to the bar that's run by a commercial business?
You buy it for me because I can't afford it. So but you are privileged.
I think the point is clear.
But it's, yes, I think it's very clear.
I think this speaks
Pumi, hang on for me first there. I want the speakers first to come in. Your voices, my sister, please bless us.
Hi. Thank you so much for the space and the conversation, and I suppose the ensuing rage, because I really agree with what you said, and I'd like to piggyback off of that to say it's a bit dishonest and disingenuous of us to think that we can draw lessons from the liberation struggle as if the way it was structured was fair and equitable to start with. It's very dishonest to do that. And I think this is why for me, in my personal politic and the politic that I organize myself around, it will always be Black queer feminism. because that is the one place where we can foreground ourselves and not have to feel like we need to defend ourselves perpetually, even in the way we mobilize. But unfortunately, because of the economies that we mobilize within, because of things like funding and all of that, this assumption that we must come together and kumbaya and hold hands, it's dishonest, because we know that ultimately, even within spaces when we speak about what it is to be queer, and I remember saying this in a breakaway session that pertained to Botswana specifically, when we speak about being queer in Botswana, more often than not, what you're speaking about is a cis queer man, right? To the exclusion of whom, when we make the framing like that. And even now in the session and the suggestion that there's not a strong enough black feminist-led movement, very dishonest as well, because Cal had developed the radical African lesbian feminist politic that was understanding that women do not experience things the same way, things do not happen to black women the same way, and yet people that want to be at the forefront of the liberation, so as to speak, are not those people that are mobilizing around the politic. And the people that are sustaining movements as well are not the ones that are at the forefront of those very movements we speak about. So I think that there's lessons to be drawn, yes, from the past, but I think let's be honest in the lessons that we decide to pick up and not romanticize this thing of, oh, you know, it was so great and we all congregated, because we all know that there was a particular tranche of people that were at the fore of it, and we know the tale of Winnie Mandela in this country and the ways in which she was excluded from the movement as if she didn't participate. And we see that to this day again, yet it's multiplying in a different way, where now it's young voices like mine that are being excluded from things. It's like being considered to be too radical, yet the radicalness that is required for movements to happen is then sanitized by respectability politics and all of the other things that we've seen happen this week, right? So if we're really going to want to speak about whether it's liberation, freedom, emancipation, all of those things, let it be from a place of honesty first. That's what my first thing was. And then leading into that as well, I also wanted to ask you, comrade, in your individual capacity, the ways in which, I mean, you've rightfully said that you two are a product of the same systems that have created all of us. So you've definitely been affected by patriarchy, you've definitely been affected by capitalism. But knowing that you are a cis-het man, in which ways have you personally contributed to not being a beneficiary of patriarchy?
All right, we're gonna take our speaker there. And then I have space for 2 more speakers, and then we will wrap up our conversation as we need to go into our next plenary. Please share your thoughts with us.
Thanks, Linda, and to the panelists for a provoking and exciting discussion. My name is Humphrey. I am from Zimbabwe, and I really wanted to reflect when you said earlier on that I think the liberation movement discussion is something that has been over and done with, and that what we need to be taking forward is the lessons from those movements. I tend to disagree, because we are ruled currently by liberation movements in Zimbabwe, and you know, by governments that still believe that you cannot change power by voting, by writing on a paper, putting an X on a piece of paper. They want to fight, they want to see blood, and in instances where we are able to organize around that possibility of winning by the pen, we see unfathomable violence in the community. It is so stuck for human rights defenders, for communities even more largely. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was really that cost to champions and to human rights defenders in spaces where the context for organizing is really a challenge. It was easier back then when we had workers' movements. More than 90% of the Zimbabwean community is an informal sector kind of arrangement, and really the trade unions that other countries leverage for their organizing is a space that we don't really quite have. So you will appreciate that those spaces that have been taken away for us to organize are also creating a challenge for us to gain the critical mass that is needed to move the agenda for those that are minority communities. And earlier on you asked, we have been engaging around LGBT issues and failing to gain traction, even amongst allies within civil society. And someone asked if this is sellable. I still want to understand, maybe from colleagues, if we really can pitch LGBTI inclusion and freedoms in our context. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So Pumi, now's your time to speak to us. Yes, and the microphones are still open. We are running in the last 5 minutes of our conversation.
Last 5 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for all the comments. I am learning as we are in conversation. I first want to pick up on the thing about resourcing our movement work. Resourcing. I think this is a critical question. We have to actually have days and days of discussing how we resource movement work going forward. I mean, one of my favorite stories for way back then was that the Danish robbed banks to send money to here, for the anti-apartheid struggle. I'm not sure anyone is going to rob anything in the north to send us money. So we need to think seriously and creatively about resourcing the movement without writing a funding proposal or having to do a report. It's a collective task. All of us have a responsibility to think about that. The second thing, on critical mass, I think that we have, there will be opportunities in which we can make and shift dramatically. And when those opportunities come, I always wonder how ready will I be to take the opportunity on, when that moment comes. And so part of being in relationship, in building the we, has to do with when those opportunities come, who's going to be coming with me to take those opportunities up. That's one. And part of it in terms of critical mass is that the system is hitting so many of us very, very hard. We feel it every day. And not one system, by the way. It's multiple systems, right, that are hitting us in a very hard way. And we can create spaces to deal about this system of white supremacy, this system of patriarchy, this system of and see them in isolation as opposed to seeing how they interconnect. And when that moment comes, which is why the issue of critical mass, supported by that we have engaged in political education work, that I'm a strongly defender of, I am style is showing that many of our organizations do that, about readying ourselves for the battle, to just use it in that way. And so that for me, it makes it become an important part. I'm not sure where I lost nose, and I think in Linda's questions about, the history and LGBTIQ specific, I think one of the important things that I am continuously reflecting on and learning is related to that first point about, to what extent is what we are learning from organizing on LGBTI issues across the continent is enabling us to understand hate crimes in South Africa, the disappearance of human rights defenders in Zimbabwe, is making me understand the cutting of healthcare services for lesbians or gay men living with HIV and so on. To what extent am I pausing so that when I understand the radical black feminist African agenda, it is located in a realistic situation that is able to respond to the conditions in which LGBTI people are finding themselves today. Because I think, some of us who are exposed, we can say intersectionality from here to kingdom come, but if we are unable to break it down to what does it mean in terms of organizing, then it will just be said. We can say radical black African feminist, But if we are not breaking it down in relation to what does that mean for organizing, it will just remain that. And I think this is the invitation to also be able to say, in as much as we embrace, defend, and uphold those things, we need to give content and substance so that we develop that platform.
Indeed. Final words.
In response to the questions that came from this side,
And the importance around knowing that we can't generalize this the conversation, because there are country contexts that are important. I think our last speaker here said it's important to not generalize it, but also ensure that contexts are affirmed, because it's different from country to country. Maybe you could also pull a few notes of closing, and if you want to say a final also, it's fine, but yes.
no, that's fine. So, Pumi, I don't know what we said that has created the perception that we are saying the liberation struggle was rosy, the liberation movements were rosy. We are actually making a critique of the national liberation struggles and the national liberation movement, and we're saying there were serious shortcomings from a range of perspectives, whether it was, as Mahmoud Mamdani would say, the perspective of democracy, or even understanding forms of social oppression, understanding gender oppression, understanding the need for queer liberation. So we acknowledge that, and we are making that critique. That's why our phrasing for this session was beyond the limits of liberation politics, because they were extremely limited. So my sister, the critique you're making is exactly the critique we are making ourselves. Perhaps we are poor communicators. Apologies for that. We were not painting that picture at all. And then, so look, my thinking and critique of dominant mainstream feminism does not discount what a range of us are doing. But still, whatever all of us are doing, we're still very far from building a critical momentum of a widespread, present, radical feminist politics. The point Pumi was saying. Otherwise, we can engage in a jamboree of competitive Olympics of who's a better radical feminist than the other. But for me, the issue is comradely, collectively, let's have a conversation of our achievements. Let's critique limited forms of feminism. Let's take the agenda further. So, for example, as much as a range of people have got set particular perspectives on radical feminism and practices and so on, but how far, for example, are we raising a radical feminist program on education, on health services, on the economy, in a way that really can transform the socio-economic conditions that determine gender relations in society? That's a challenge facing all of us. It's not so much about saying I'm doing better than the other and so on. So that's the approach I'm putting on the table. Let's push the envelope further, critically, collectively, comradely, in a way that deepens the ties, that take forward the concept of liberation. I will leave it there in that regard. And then, as for my personal journey and the related questions about what am I doing in my life personally and so on. As a man born in an oppressive society, I cannot ever claim ever to be a free man. I started my journey of engagement with feminist politics in 1991 at university. And my former wife, we were together in the political development in that regard. She would make the critique, say, don't ever claim you are a free man, because being a free man means you are free from doing domestic duties and so on. That was their critique of my own personal conduct. And then the public posture that's out there, if you talk about gender language and so on. So I'm raising that to underline that old feminist ethic about how the personal is political, how the political is personal, and to add one more point, that actually that's a lifelong journey that, in my case, I acknowledge it's going to be a constant struggle. I've been a committed and engaged activist, going back to actually the late 80s as a young student, and then exposed to feminism in the early 90s. And all I've done when it comes to LGBTI liberation is to make a contribution in solidarity with others at various moments, as a student leader, as an activist. That's something I continue to do. And I'm not posing that to say, therefore I'm absolved of all crimes of heteropatriarchy. I'm still very much involved in crimes of heteropatriarchy, but consciously struggling with myself on a daily basis about how do I become someone who can take the path to emancipation and bring it closer. The last point is about the country differences and so on. I don't think there's a problem with country-specific strategies, country-specific contexts. All I think that is important is what are the commonalities in our countries that can help us build a bigger understanding. Maybe the word commonalities is not the right word. What are the bigger dynamics that inform, that shape oppression, exploitation, and marginalization that run across different countries? Because what happens in my country actually is not so different if you look at the roots. And that, for me, that's the issue. How do we draw the strands, connect the dots in ways that can help us deepen country-specific strategies? For me, I think it's to use an old word, it's a dialectic. It's not one way.
And it's also very hard to say, to read a country-specific context, because it will affect all the other countries. Anyway.
Yes.
Done.
Thank you very much, guys. Everybody, we've come to the end of our discussion. This is not a discussion that ends here. There are greater narratives that we need to reflect on who we are as a movement, because we're just discussing about working with others outside. We haven't even discussed about working with each other intra-movements. And I think that's also a conversation to interrogate and figure out, are we in line and in sync with each other, and also at the same time learn from our lessons and gains that we've done over the years. But other than that, our next discussion would be introduced by Kopano. Other than that, thank you very much, and thank you, Masi.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you.
Oh, you have graduated. I am giving you a prize on behalf of other foundations. They say, this is a book, I think. You want to see? Okay, you can look at it. It's fine. I don't know, there's probably some necklaces in there, because I have heard this morning it was about books. So I don't know what is in that box.